Hi, I'm George with Music Production Alliance. Today, I want to show you how I set up cue mixes using Presonus Studio One 3.3 and the Clarette8PreX audio interface from Focusrite. Let's go to the Focusrite control first. I'm starting with an empty slate. The Clarette8PreX provides you with 10 outputs. Let's set them up in the Focusrite control panel. Let's select the software playback output. As you know, 1 and 2 corresponds with your monitor speakers, if that's where you have them connected. As you can see, there's audio there. If you go to line outputs 3 and 4, you see that the 1 and 2 are hidden or grayed out. What you have here is software playback set up via 3 and 4. A direct one-to-one relationship, but the output is not set up. Here is 5 and 6, 7, 8. Let's focus on 3 outputs for now. 1 and 2, 7 and 8, 9 and 10. Looking at output 1 and 2, you need to make sure that this is not muted or soloed. That's the only output you need to have there for now. Let's go to output 7 and 8. The first thing we need to do here is mute playback 1 and 2. The way output 7 and 8 is set up is in a custom mix format. You have your playback DAW, which you can select how to route the audio from your DAW. You have a hardware input, where you can also select, or you have a custom mix. For setting up cue mixes, we want to use the custom mix option. Okay, we're on line output 7, 8. We have muted playback 1 and 2. Let's bring in 7, 8. Now we have our software playback channel 7, 8. Okay, now let's go back to 1 and 2. In 1 and 2, we have to make sure that 1 and 2 is not muted. Mute 7, 8. So that only 1 and 2 is playing back during playback. 7, 8, make sure 1 and 2 is muted, but not 7, 8. Now let's go to 9 and 10. Make sure that playback 1 and 2 is muted. Playback 7 and 8 is muted. Now let's add 9 and 10. Okay, let's hit play again. Okay, notice that there's only audio coming out of 1 and 2. Let's relabel 7 and 8. Let's call line output 7 and 8 headphone amp number 1. And let's call line out 9 and 10 headphone amp number 2. Headphone amp number 1 corresponds to the first pan knob in front of the Clarette8PreX. Headphone amp number 2 corresponds to the second pan pot, the second knob on the headphone amp in front of the Clarette8PreX. We now have the routing set up appropriately in Focusrite control. Outputs 1 and 2, not muted, but since you've set up 7, 8, 9, and 10, both 7, 8, 9, and 10 have to be muted and outputs 1 and 2. The only output that should be playing back is playback 1 and 2. This is what you're hearing on your speakers. Let's relabel this. Let's call this speakers. Let's call this headphone amp 1. Let's call this headphone amp 2. Let's hit play again. Okay. 7, 8. Make sure playback 1, 2 is muted. Playback 9 and 10 is muted. The only thing that should not be muted is playback 7, 8, which is headphone amp 1. Let's go to 9 and 10. Playback 1, 2 muted, 7, 8 muted, 9 and 10 is not muted. Okay, so this is example number 1. This format would only be used if you're only using headphone inputs 1 and 2 in front of the Clarette8PreX. If you were sending a separate signal to headphone input number 1 and a separate signal to headphone input number 2. These are the outputs. When I say input, I'm referring to the actual hole or the actual jack where you would connect the headphone jack. Let's move on. Here are my drum tracks. Here is my mixer. As you see, your cue mixes are not set up yet. Otherwise, you would see them here. Let's set them up. Let's go to the preferences. And let's go to song setup. Let's not look in the inputs tab, but look in the outputs tab only. At the moment, we only have outputs 1 and 2 set up, which correspond with your speakers. Let's set up the 2 cue mixes that we need to set up for outputs 7, 8 and outputs 9, 10. So we need 2 stereo tracks. Add stereo, add stereo. Let's rename this. Headphone app 1, headphone app 2. Okay, headphone app 1 needs to be routed to output 7, 8. So we go here to Studio One, select 7, 8. If you just hover over the little box, you'll see a menu pop up that gives you the name, output 7. But because this output was set up as a stereo output, the moment I click on one box, it sets up both left and right. 7, 8, and let's set up headphone amp 2 to 9, 10. Now you have 2 cue mixes set up. But before you move on, make sure you tick this box, which is the cue mix box. That's going to give you the 2 menus on your Studio One tracks. Let's leave the boxes unchecked just so that you can see the difference. Hit OK. Nothing here. Let's go back to preferences. Song setup. Now let's take headphone amp 1. Check the headphone amp 2 as well. Hit OK. Now you can see the actual outputs or the cue mixes set up on each of the tracks. Let's move this up a little bit so we can see both. Now we have headphone amp 1 and headphone amp 2. Okay, let's go back to Focusrite control. Let's hit play. Okay, now you can see the actual levels coming through each of the outputs. Let's say that you were recording the bass guitar and the electric guitar. Let's add 2 tracks. Let's add 2 mono tracks. They're audio, mono. Hit OK. Let's label this one bass and this one guitar. The bass player may not want to hear too much overheads. And the guitar player may want to hear the overheads just so that he can feel the room a bit more and he can get more inspiration. Let me rearrange my drum tracks. So what we want to do now is we want to send the audio to headphone amp 1, which the bass player is using. Let's set that up. Let's get rid of headphone amp 2 and let's get rid of headphone amp 1. Just click on the first track. The bass player wants kick and snare only. So I'm going to erase it here. Here's the kick for headphone amp 1. And the kick in, that was the kick out. He also wants the hats, and he wants a little bit of snare. Okay, the bass player, let me relabel this. Let's make this easier on us. Let's relabel the cue mixes. Let's call this bass Q. Just call it bass Q, bass C. Let's call this guitar C. Okay, that way it's easier. Okay, so now you see it here. The guitar player wants a little bit of kick, a little bit of hi-hats, snare top and bottom. He doesn't care about the toms or the room, he just wants overhead. Now when I hit play, okay, now the guitar player is going to hear only what's being sent through the cue mixes, as you can see here by the levels, and the bass player is only going to hear his cue mixes. I hope this makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions. Speak to you soon.